Mike McDermott, and today we're going to look at two campaigns that bring us right up to the closing days of the American Civil War. The first is the catastrophe fought by the Federals at Cold Harbor. Abandoning the battlefield at Spotsylvania, General Grant began moving the Army of the Potomac south during the night of the 20th of May. General Lee soon realized that the Federals were again swinging to his right and immediately had troops on the march to stay between the Federals and the capital of Richmond. The two armies collided 3 days later on the North Anna River, where General Grant probed strong rebel defenses and decided to continue maneuvering. On the 1st of June, leading elements of both armies fought an inconclusive action at Cold Harbor, a crossroads some 60 miles from Spotsylvania and only 15 miles from downtown Richmond. Soon, 60,000 Confederates had constructed 7 miles of well-prepared defensive positions, and 110,000 Federals were preparing to attack and break their lines. If successful, the rebels would be out of maneuver room and General Grant would be in Richmond. The alternative for the Federals was to swing left again and force General Lee into the capital's fortifications. But that would result in an extended siege, which was not General Grant's preference. So Union troops prepared to assault and break through an extraordinarily strong Confederate defense at Cold Harbor. Both flanks of the Confederate position were covered by flooding rivers, and cannon were in place to provide enfilading fire along trench lines where interlocking fields of massed infantry fire had been carefully planned. General Grant initially ordered the attack for dawn on the 2nd of June, but had to postpone for a day because of problems with troop movement. The delay allowed rations to be issued and a night rest before 60,000 men, who were concentrated on the left flank of the Union line, charged the enemy's positions before sunup on the 3rd of June. The assault was met with a blast of fire and stopped during less than 10 minutes of carnage. But rather than pulling back, the Federals dug in close to the rebels' barricades and then charged again with the same result. Subsequent orders to assault were ignored by the troops, who got below ground as best they could while firing blindly toward the rebel fortifications. One Confederate later recalled what he glimpsed when a Federal charge got to point-blank range. And he wrote, "I could see the dust fog out of a man's clothing in 2 or 3 places, where as many rifle balls would strike him at the same moment." Another man wrote, "They halted and began to dodge, lay down, and recoil. The dead and dying lay in front of our lines in triangle shapes. The apex were the bravest men who came nearest to our defenses under our deadly fire." An Alabama colonel, looking to his immediate front after Union troops attacked in close, packed ranks, saw, quote, "the dead covered more than 5 acres of ground, about as thickly as they could be laid out." By noon, when General Grant stopped the orders to assault, the Federals had suffered about 7,000 casualties, and the rebels had lost approximately 1,500 men. Miserable and dangerous trench warfare continued there at Cold Harbor for the next 9 days. When the Union Army pulled back behind a line of trenches that they had built to protect their withdrawal. The Federals then, moving to the left again, crossed the south bank of the James River on a pontoon bridge that measured 2,100 feet in length, the longest constructed in the history of American military operations. General Grant intended to seize Petersburg, which was just south of Richmond, and cut the rail lines that ran from the south into Richmond, forcing the Confederates to either abandon the capital or extend their fortifications farther to the west of Petersburg. The attack at Cold Harbor on the 3rd of June concluded a month of constant fighting and maneuver since the Army of the Potomac had crossed the repeated river en route to the wilderness, a period of federal persistence that caused 55,000 Union casualties, while Confederate losses during that same period were estimated at 40,000 men. In a letter dated the 5th of June, General Grant reviewed his strategy, and he wrote, "My idea from the start had been to beat Lee's army, if possible, north of Richmond, but all cannot be accomplished that I had designed. The feeling of the two armies now seems to be that the rebels can protect themselves only by strong entrenchments, while our army is not only confident of protecting themselves without entrenchments, but can beat and drive the enemy whenever and wherever he can be found without that kind of protection." A Confederate sergeant named George Eggleston recalled the changing nature of the war, and he wrote, "By the time of Cold Harbor, men in the ranks of the Army of Northern Virginia realized that Grant was not going to retreat, that he was not going to be removed from command because he had failed to break Lee's resistance, and that the policy of pounding had begun." Sergeant Eggleston then continued, "There was no fear of anything that Grant might do, but there was an appalling and well-founded fear of starvation in the ranks, which indeed some of us were already suffering. Hunger to starving men is totally unrelated to the desire for food. It's a great agony of the whole body and of the soul as well. When we reached Cold Harbor, the command to which I belonged had been marching for more than 50 hours without any food, and for the first time, we knew what actual starvation felt like." The night before the battle, Lieutenant Colonel Horace Porter, serving on General Grant's staff, visited several camps and later recorded, "I noticed that many of the soldiers had taken off their coats and seemed to be engaged in sewing them, but on closer inspection found that the men were calmly writing their names and home addresses on slips of paper and pinning them to the backs of their coats so that their bodies might be recognized and their fate made known to their families at home." Several days later, a blood-stained diary taken from the pocket of a dead Union soldier contained this final entry: "June 3, Cold Harbor, I was killed." Sergeant Solon Blaisdell, assigned to Company F, 12th Regiment, New Hampshire Volunteers, recounted, "I was struck by a musket ball directly over the heart so severely that I was knocked over and laid in a senseless position for some time, my life being saved by my roll books." That is, as a sergeant, he was responsible for accounting for men kept on a roll, "my diary, and my wife's picture. Our company went into the engagement 48 strong and came out with 3 men fit for duty." And thus ended the bloodbath at Cold Harbor. The siege of Petersburg consisted of a series of battles fought over a 10-month period from June 1864 until March of the following year. General Grant's efforts to isolate and capture the Confederate capital and General Lee's commitment to defending the city resulted in more than 30 miles of fortifications from the eastern outskirts of Richmond, extending to the south, and then west to cover the approaches to Petersburg. The frustrated attacks and raids and persistent lethal sniping provided a model for subsequent battles where infantry and artillery support could not overcome a well-prepared static defense. But in the case at Petersburg, the Federals were able to force the issue when, by dint of their superior numbers, they stretched the Confederate defenses to the breaking point, and the rebels had to leave their trenches and move into the open countryside. But before that happened, a great deal of fighting took place in the face-off between the Confederate defenders and the Federal attackers. With a population of 18,000, Petersburg was also the junction of 5 railroads, making it a major transportation hub and supply base for the entire region, to include Richmond. The siege warfare both General Lee and General Grant wanted to avoid thus became a reality as the Federals attempted to break through those rebel defenses. During the 4-day period from 15 through 18 June, as an example, Union casualties totaled 11,386 soldiers, while the Confederates lost approximately 4,000 men. During one assault, the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery Regiment had 632 of the 900 men assigned either killed or wounded, giving it the distinction of being the regiment with the greatest battle loss in one day for the entire war. Having failed to capture Petersburg initially by assault, General Grant moved to destroy the railroads that continued to supply the cities. From 21 June until 1 July, infantry and cavalry attacks on rail lines resulted in battles that saw heavy Union casualties. Stretches of rail were torn up before being recaptured, repaired, and put back into operation by the Confederates. The troops of both armies were exhausted from marching at night and fighting during the day over those lines of communication. But by the end of July, Federal strength in the trenches facing Richmond and Petersburg totaled approximately 110,000 soldiers, and the Confederates had about 57,000 men defending in their trenches. In conjunction with a series of Federal attacks against Richmond to hold the rebels in place, General Grant began pushing south and west, forcing a series of fights that lasted through March of 1865. And as he moved west, the Confederates, of course, were forced to extend their lines to the west as well. Battles at Globe Tavern, Ream Station, People's Farm, the Boynton Plank Road, Hatcher's Run, White Oak Road, and the Dinwiddie Courthouse exacted their toll and forced the Confederates to further thin their defenses as they extended to meet the new Federal threats. The breaking point came on the 1st of April at Five Forks, a road junction controlling the South Side Railroad. During a day's fighting, the Federals inflicted about 1,000 casualties on the defenders and took over 3,000 prisoners. General Grant ordered a general assault for the next day against all of the Confederate defenses at Richmond and Petersburg. And those attacks succeeded in breaking through Confederate lines. Both Petersburg and Richmond were occupied on the 3rd of April, forcing General Lee to begin his march to Appomattox. Union casualties during the 10-month siege totaled approximately 42,000 men, while the Confederates lost about 28,000 soldiers. When notified that the Confederate capital of Richmond had been occupied, President Lincoln told Admiral David Porter, "Thank God I have lived to see this. It seems to me that I have been dreaming a horrid dream for the past 4 years, and now the nightmare is finally gone." Well, it wasn't completely over, but there was no question about what the outcome was going to soon be. And in the next video, we'll focus on Appomattox and the end of the American Civil War. And until then, God bless America.